My name is Celine Hartley. I was 25 when everything changed. I remember the exact weight of the phone in my hand the night my mother called to tell me she wouldn't be coming to my father's funeral arrangements. She was too tired, she said, and my older brother Marcus would handle things, since he was better with paperwork. I stood in my kitchen, still in my work clothes, staring at a stack of unpaid invoices from the small design studio I'd built from nothing, and I understood something I hadn't let myself understand before. I had spent my whole life being the daughter no one needed until there was something to lose. The studio was quiet that week. I kept working anyway, because working was the only thing that made the grief feel like it had somewhere to go. My father had been sick for 11 months. I was the one who drove him to appointments, who learned the names of his medications, who sat with him in waiting rooms that smelled like antiseptic and vending machine coffee. Marcus visited twice. My mother visited when it was convenient, for her book club schedule. I don't say this with bitterness, or I try not to. I say it because it's true, and because for a long time I thought if I just did enough, gave enough, stayed patient enough, someone would finally look at me and say, "I see what you've carried." No one did. At the reading of the will, my father's small estate, a modest house, some savings, a life insurance policy, went almost entirely to Marcus. "He has a family to think about," my mother said, not quite meeting my eyes. "You're young. You'll be fine." I sat in that lawyer's office with my hands folded in my lap, and I felt something in me go very still and very quiet, the way a lake goes still before a storm arrives from somewhere you can't yet see. I didn't argue. I didn't cry in front of them. I said, "Okay," and I drove home, and I sat on my kitchen floor for a long time with my back against the cabinet, not really thinking anything at all. Later, going through a box of my father's old things, the one thing he'd left specifically to me, a battered cedar chest full of photographs and letters, I found a folder I didn't expect. Bank statements. A separate account, one none of us knew about. And beneath it, a letter addressed, in his careful handwriting, to me. I didn't open it that night. I wasn't ready for whatever truth was waiting inside it. The letter sat on my desk for 6 days. I'd walk past it in the mornings before work, glance at my name in my father's handwriting, Celine, and feel my chest tighten in a way I didn't have words for yet. Grief has a strange geometry. It doesn't move in straight lines. Some days I could function, answer client emails, sketch layouts for a wedding invitation suite, laugh at something my assistant said. Other days I'd catch my reflection in the studio window and not recognize the tired stillness in my own eyes. Marcus called twice that week, not to check on me, to ask if I'd found anything else in Dad's things. Documents, he meant, assets. I told him I hadn't, which was, technically, still true. I hadn't read the letter yet. My mother sent one text. "Hope you're doing okay, sweetheart." For words, no punctuation urgency, sent at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday between what I assumed were episodes of whatever show she was watching. I didn't respond. I wasn't being cruel. I simply didn't have anything true to say that wouldn't hurt one of us. On the 7th night, I made tea I didn't drink, sat at my kitchen table, and opened the letter. "Celine," it began, "if you're reading this, I didn't get the chance to tell you myself, and I'm sorry for that. I want you to know I saw everything. The drives, the nights in that hospital chair, the way you never once made me feel like a burden, even when I know I was one. Your mother and Marcus love you in their own way, but they have never had to see the way I saw you, because they were never in the room. There's an account. It's not much, but it's yours, separate from the estate, set up quietly 2 years ago so no one could argue about it later. The paperwork is with Halloran and Cole downtown. Ask for Dennis. He has the documents, and he has something else, a recording I made for you, back when I could still speak clearly. I wanted you to hear it from me, not read it from me. I'm proud of you. I don't think I said that enough. Go hear the rest." I sat with that letter for a long time, the tea going cold, my own reflection ghostly in the dark window behind the table. I felt no triumph, only a strange, aching relief, the particular relief of being seen, finally, even if it had taken my father's death to make it visible. I called Dennis the next morning. Halloran and Cole occupied the 4th floor of an old brick building downtown, the kind with creaking elevators and frosted glass doors that still had names stenciled in gold. Dennis turned out to be an older man with kind, tired eyes and a manner that suggested he delivered 100 difficult letters like my father's before. "Your father came to me 18 months ago," he said, sliding a folder across the desk. He was very clear about what he wanted. He didn't want to fight in a courtroom. He wanted it quiet, and he wanted it to only reach you when the time was right. Inside the folder, an account statement, not enormous, but enough to matter, enough to clear the studio's debts and give me breathing room I hadn't had in years. Beneath it, a flash drive. I listened to the recording in my car in the parking garage, unwilling to wait until I got home. My father's voice, thinner than I remembered but unmistakably his, filled the small space. He talked about the hospital visits. He talked about a night I barely remembered, one where I'd fallen asleep in the vinyl chair beside his bed and he'd stayed awake watching me, wondering how I raised a daughter with more patience than her whole family combined, and never told her so. He talked about Marcus, gently, without cruelty. "Your brother isn't a bad man, Celine. He's just never had to be tested the way you have." And about my mother, with something closer to weary forgiveness than anger. And then he said the thing that undid me completely. "I know what they're going to do with the house and the rest." I let it happen, because fighting it would have cost us the last months we had together, and I wasn't willing to spend them arguing. But I wasn't going to let you walk away with nothing, not the money, and not the truth. You were the one who showed up. I want you to know that I know it. I cried in that parking garage for the first time since the funeral, not from grief alone, but from the specific ache of finally being witnessed. When I came home, there was a message for Marcus. He'd heard I'd been to the lawyer's office. He wanted to know why. I didn't answer right away. I wanted to think about what kind of truth I actually wanted to tell. I thought, at first, about saying nothing at all. There was a version of this story where I simply took what my father had left me, quietly restructured my life, and let Marcus and my mother continue believing whatever story let them sleep at night. Some nights that felt like the wiser path, the one that cost me the least. But something in my father's recording kept surfacing in my mind, unbidden, at strange hours. I wasn't going to let you walk away without the truth. He hadn't wanted this hidden forever. He'd wanted it revealed on my terms, when I was ready, not as an act of war, but as an act of honesty. I decided I wasn't interested in confrontation for its own sake. I had watched enough families implode over money to know that shouting matches rarely produced anything but more wounds. What I wanted was simpler and, in its way, harder. I wanted my family to understand, clearly, undeniably, what they had actually done and what it had actually cost. So, I invited them to dinner. Not a courtroom. Not a scene. My apartment, a Sunday evening, the kind of ordinary setting where difficult truths sometimes land hardest precisely because no one expects a reckoning over roast chicken. Marcus arrived first, cautious, scanning the room like a man checking for landmines. My mother came 15 minutes later, overdressed for the occasion in the way she always was when she felt uncertain and wanted armor. We made small talk through most of the meal. I let them. I wasn't in a hurry anymore. There's a particular kind of calm that settles over you once you've stopped needing someone else's apology to feel whole. I'd found a version of that calm somewhere between the letter and the recording, and I intended to hold on to it. It was Marcus who finally asked, setting his fork down with theatrical casualness.
"So,
What did Dad's lawyer want?" I looked at him for a long moment, not with anger, with something closer to clarity. He wanted to make sure I heard the truth. I said, "Since none of you were ever planning to tell it to me yourselves." The room went very quiet. I didn't raise my voice. I want to be clear about that, because for years I'd imagined this moment, if I'd ever let myself imagine it at all, as something loud, something with tears and accusations flung across a table. It wasn't that. It was quieter than either of them expected, which somehow made it land harder. I told them about the account. I told them about the recording. I didn't play it for them. That felt like something too private, too tender, to hand over as ammunition. Instead, I told them, plainly, what he'd said, that he'd seen everything.
the drives.
The nights in the hospital chair. The years of showing up while they, in their own ways, had not. My mother's face went through several expressions in quick succession. Surprise, something that might have been shame, and then, predictably, defensiveness. We didn't abandon you, Celine. We had our own lives. You never said you needed help. I shouldn't have had to say it, I said. I was there every week for 11 months. You knew. You just decided it wasn't your job to notice. Marcus, to his credit, didn't argue the facts. He sat very still, jaw tight, staring at a point somewhere past my shoulder. I didn't know about the account, he said finally. I swear I didn't know. I believe you, I said, and I meant it. This was never really about the money. The money was just the place where the truth had finally surfaced, the way a stone works its way up through soil after a long winter. What do you want from us? My mother asked, and there was something almost fearful in her voice, as if she expected me, after all this silence, to finally demand something enormous. Retribution. An apology performed loudly enough to satisfy years of neglect. I thought about it honestly before I answered. I don't want anything from you, I said. I wanted you to know that I know. That's all. What you do with that is yours to carry now. I watched something in my mother's posture crumple, quietly, the way old paper folds rather than tears. They left not long after that. There were no dramatic exits, no slammed doors, just a subdued, unfinished quiet, the kind that follows a truth too large to be resolved over a single dinner. My mother hugged me at the door, briefly, stiffly, and said, I don't know how to fix this, which was, I think, the most honest thing she'd said to me in years. I didn't sleep much that night. Not from anguish, from a strange, unfamiliar lightness, the kind that comes after setting down something you've carried so long you'd forgotten it had weight. In the weeks that followed, nothing resolved neatly. Marcus texted a handful of times, awkward, searching messages that circled around an apology he didn't quite know how to complete. My mother called once and cried on the phone for 11 minutes without either of us saying very much of substance, but she called, and that was, in its small way, new. I used my father's money to stabilize the studio, to finally hire the junior designer I'd been putting off for a year, to breathe for the first time in a long while without the low hum of financial dread underneath everything I did. I framed one line from his letter. I saw everything, and hung it in my office, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that being witnessed, even once, even late, could be enough to rebuild a life around. I went back to Halloran and Cole once more, near the end of that month, not for paperwork this time, but simply to thank Dennis for the care he'd taken in honoring my father's wishes. He told me something I've held on to since. Your father didn't want you to win, Celine. He wanted you to be seen. There's a difference. I understood, finally, what he meant. Revenge, I realized, had never really been what I wanted, not the kind that leaves wreckage, not the kind that makes a villain out of people who are simply flawed and human and limited in the ways all of us are limited. What I had wanted, underneath the years of quiet resentment, was so much simpler. To matter. To be noticed. To be spoken of, at least once, in the past tense of someone's gratitude. My father had given me that, even from beyond the reach of his own voice. Autumn arrived slowly that year, the way it does in cities, not in a single dramatic turn but in small increments, a chill in the morning air, the studio windows fogging faintly before I wiped them clear. I found myself thinking of my father often, not with the raw ache of the first weeks but with something softer, steadier, the particular tenderness of missing someone you finally feel you understood. Marcus and I met for coffee in October. It wasn't smooth. There were long pauses, the kind two people fill with careful, unfinished sentences when neither wants to reopen a wound but both know it needs air to heal. He told me, haltingly, that he'd started seeing things differently, that becoming a father himself, 2 years ago, had made him realize how much he hadn't paid attention to in his own life and in mine. It wasn't a full reckoning. It wasn't everything I might once have wanted from him, but it was real, and I'd learned by then not to dismiss real things simply because they arrived smaller than I'd imagined. My mother and I are still finding our way towards something. Some Sundays she calls and we talk about nothing, the weather, a recipe, a show she's watching, and I let the nothing be enough because I've come to understand that some relationships heal in inches, not in single grand gestures over dinner tables. The studio grew that autumn. A feature in a small design magazine. A referral from a client who'd become something like a friend. I stood in the office one evening, staring at the framed line from my father's letter, and felt, for the first time in longer than I could remember, that my life belonged entirely to me, not shaped around the hope of being noticed, not built in the shadow of who my family had decided I should be, but built, quietly and deliberately, on my own foundations. I thought about the woman I'd been at that lawyer's office, folding her hands in her lap, saying okay to a decision that erased her. I didn't recognize her anymore, not fully. Grief and truth, it turns out, can do that, carve you down to something truer than what came before. I visited my father's grave in late November, on a gray, quiet morning, the kind where the cold feels less like an assault and more like a hush settling over everything. I brought the letter with me, though I'd read it so many times by then I could recite it without looking. I sat on the frost-stiffened grass beside the headstone and told him, out loud, foolishly, the way you talk to someone who can't answer but might, somehow, still be listening. I told him about the studio, about Marcus's slow, imperfect thaw, about my mother's small Sunday calls that were teaching me the shape of forgiveness in miniature. I didn't take revenge, I told him. I don't think I ever really wanted to. I just wanted them to know what I carried. And I think that was enough. The wind moved through the bare trees above me, and for a moment I let myself believe it carried something back, not an answer, nothing so simple as that, but a kind of quiet acknowledgement, the same quiet acknowledgement I'd felt the night I first heard his voice in that parking garage. I understood, sitting there, that the story I'd been telling myself for years, the story of the daughter who was overlooked, overworked, and left with nothing, had been true, but incomplete. There had been another story running alongside it the whole time, one my father had seen clearly even when I couldn't see it myself. The story of a woman who kept showing up anyway, who built something out of the wreckage of being unseen, who chose, in the end, truth over cruelty and dignity over destruction. I stood, brushed the frost from my coat, and pressed my palm briefly to the cold stone. "Thank you for seeing me," I said. Then I walked back to my car, back to the studio, back to the life I was building, quietly, deliberately, entirely my own, and did not look back.